So I know that we will be bringing on our next guest very shortly. I see that we are now joined by the incredible Peter Van Buren, who is a whistleblower in his own right and has authored multiple books. He spent 24 years at the State Department. One of them was in Iraq. And I'm so looking forward to hearing what he has to say about the current situation with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and how his journey as a writer and a whistleblower has intersected with so many other important whistleblowers. So welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I apologize for any technical problems we've had getting connected here.
Not a problem at all. So for the viewers and listeners who are not as familiar with your amazing history and your amazing, personal story, can you remind us and take us through the journey that led you from 24 years at the State Department to becoming a whistleblower and fighting for the fact that you had not, published classified information, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it's almost not by coincidence that I'm here. I worked for the State Department for 24 years, and I was, for most of that time, a remarkably mediocre bureaucrat. I was not an overtly political person, and I certainly understood my role in government was to implement American policy, and I was more or less comfortable with that. The problems came after the State Department assigned me to the reconstruction program in Iraq. And for those who don't recall, in the year 2006 and afterwards, when the United States began what we call the surge, the attempt to remake Iraq into a popular democracy where we would be loved, we began a lengthy process of spending lots and lots of money, billions and billions of dollars, building roads and schools and things like that. And the idea was the terrorism would go away and the Iraqis would like us, and this Sunni Shia thing, whatever complicated mess that was, that'd all be fixed. I was not much of a person who understood this. The State Department really was just looking for cannon fodder to send to Iraq. And I went there with the intent to be that cannon fodder. I did not intend to make waves. But what I saw there in terms of the waste that we were engaged in terms of the fraud and corruption we were creating in Iraq by bringing lots and lots of money, by the harm we were actually doing. Our spending, for example, drove up the price of medicines and vaccines so that when we weren't purchasing them, the Iraqis couldn't either. When I realized the harm that we were doing and the role that I was playing, something changed in me, an act of conscience, if you will. I realized that I was in the middle of something that was being presented at home to the American people as successful, when in fact I was watching it fail in front of me. It was a lie. I was participating in that lie, and people's lives were being harmed, if not ruined, because of that lie. And my silence would have only continued to perpetuate it. I tried to go through channels. I tried to do all the right things that whistleblowers are supposed to do. Was shut down at every turn, told that I maybe just was having a little bit of PTSD and, have a drink, relax, and all the way up to basically just being told, be quiet. It's not corruption. It is our job. Eventually, that conscience, that voice in my head became too strong to ignore. And I wrote a book called We Meant Well, how I helped lose the battle for the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people. And that book told what I saw in Iraq. And it came out in 2011. As hard as it is now to think back, in 2011, the Obama administration was telling people that the war had been won, that we had been successful, that Iraq was a democracy, that American troops were coming home with their heads held high for the work that they did. And I knew all of that to not be true. It was not true under George Bush, and it was not true under Obama. I support neither man as president. I support the truth. And the truth here was that was a lie. And my book told that story. Surprising as it seems, the U.S. government was not pleased that I was clarifying this for the American people. And in fact, the State Department under then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton tried to stop me in a number of ways. They initially falsely claimed that I had released classified information in the book, and that was not true, and we were able to prove that administratively. They then found a link, emphasizing the word link, on my blog to a WikiLeaks document, and decided that that link represented me leaking classified information. The words get kind of fuzzy here. That link represented a leak of classified information, and through that process took away the security clearance that I had held without challenge for 23 years. That led to a series of personnel decisions, all done within the State Department system, to try to drive me out. The process they were using, a national security firing, would have deprived me of the pension that I had earned over my years of service. And that was something that I simply could not stand. In addition, I learned only later through Discovery and Freedom of Information Act that the State Department referred my case to the Department of Justice as a possible Espionage Act prosecution, basically prosecuting me under the Espionage Act for a link. That seems kind of silly until you remember the case of Barrett Brown, who was in fact convicted and sent to jail over linking to classified documents. I was something of, I guess, of a test case that didn't quite pan out. The irony of all of this, and let's see what I need to do to turn on my camera for you. I didn't realize I'm not
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. We have hiccups. It's not a problem at all. But I'm completely fascinated by the way in which, this narrative of suppression of the truth under the cover of espionage has, as you said, developed. With you as maybe a test case in that. And what do you think this means about the statement of, the freedom of the press, etc., when that type of just simple publishing and discussing the truth is prosecuted and persecuted in this way? And
well,
we can see you great now.
May I ask if you're seeing the video now?
Yes, we can see. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I apologize for the way I look. I forgot to shave this morning, so I'm hoping to get to that after we get off the air here. What was happening to me was in many ways the beginnings of a system of prosecution that we now see in full bloom. The idea of looking for an excuse, whether that excuse is something as broad as the publishing of millions of documents, as Julian Assange will be prosecuted if the American government can get that chance, or whether it's as simple as a link on a blog that took down Barrett Brown, or that they tried to experiment with me. It's simply a series of legal manipulations, manipulating the tools that are available to government, in my case, seeking to deprive me of income, throwing me out of my job, putting me in a position where I would literally not be able to feed myself or my family. It's simply a process of pulling the strings, using the tools to silence people. And it shows that the government is willing to take those steps on a very large scale against someone like Julian, who has a global reach, or someone like me that was operating at a very, very low level, basically embarrassing the government using unclassified information to call them out as liars. It is no surprise that in the midst of all of this, and during my story and the others, the Obama administration went on to eventually prosecute 8 people under the Espionage Act, a 1917 law that prior to the Obama administration had never been used anywhere near that many times in total. Obama prosecuted more people during his term in office than since 1917 up till the beginnings of his prosecution. It was an extraordinary overreach of government to silence people. And in fact, it has proven to be a very effective tool. We just saw it used for the first time by the Trump administration against Reality Winner for allegedly leaking a document to The Intercept. What concerns me, and then we can return to my little bit of history here, is the way that this is all being masked against Julian Assange. To begin with, the United States has joined the ranks of petty tyrannies, such as the communist Chinese and the Soviet Russians, in imprisoning someone they don't like in a foreign embassy. The United States for 15 years held a Catholic cardinal, allowed him to live in our embassy in Budapest, Hungary, to protect him from the Soviets. We allowed Fan Linger to stay in our embassy in Beijing for a year to save him from the communists there. We allowed the blind Chinese dissident Chun to live in our embassy to protect him. We allowed 6 Russian religious dissidents to stay in our embassy in Moscow and negotiated their free passage to Israel eventually to protect them. Now the tables have turned, and it's the United States who's the tyrant, who's the bully, who's the petty one, basically trying to smoke Julian Assange into a position where he can be taken into custody. And these tools, which have been refined in their use against American whistleblowers, will be turned against him. That said, back to my story. The State Department moved to fire me and eventually found what they felt were solid grounds. They eventually planned to fire me for not cooperating in the investigation to fire me. They said that I was obligated to testify against myself, to give information against myself, that as a federal employee, I didn't have the protections of the Fifth Amendment, and that I was insubordinate, and that was grounds to fire me. And things probably would have ended there had I not been lucky enough to meet a woman named Jess Raddick. And if that name is familiar to people watching here, it's because Jess has worked with Chelsea Manning, she's worked with Julian Assange, she's worked with Edward Snowden, and she's worked with Reality Winner and many other whistleblowers, John Kiriakou, Thomas Drake, the list is very long. I was fairly early in her tenure. I joked that I was a practice case for her, but she did magnificently. She enlisted the American Civil Liberties Union and put my situation forward to the State Department as a free speech issue, that as a federal government employee, I had the right to write a book, to speak out freely, and that the efforts to stop me from speaking were both pointless and unconstitutional. A lot of bureaucracy passed underneath us, and eventually it was decided that my quote-unquote early retirement from the State Department was going to be the best way out of this. It allowed me to meet my obligations to my children and my family financially by keeping my pension. It allowed the State Department to sweep this all under the rug. Ironically, all this was happening concurrently with the Secretary of State running a server that was transmitting classified information. But that's how history goes. But I want to circle back to something about these connections between myself and Julian. And they're not simply these larger connections that we stand on the same side on these same issues, but they go all the way back to the desert in Iraq. I was assigned as the only State Department person at a facility out in the desert, the eastern desert, called Forward Operating Base Hammer. And across the hall from me was a secure communications office where a young private, then serving under the name Bradley Manning, was going through the same acts and challenges of conscience that I was. I didn't know Manning. I met her, I'm sure, a number of times because I was in and out of that office for my own business many times. The facilities at the base were small. There was only one place to eat, one place to take a shower, one gym, one this, one that. So I'm sure that she and I crossed paths any number of times, but I didn't knowingly speak with her. And I sat there agonizing over my own decisions to blow the whistle on what I was seeing, unaware that literally 5 feet away from me was another brave American going through that same process. Now, Manning was way ahead of me. Her decision to record the State Department cables, to make a DVD of the collateral, become known as Collateral Murder of American War Crimes, to capture the Afghan and Iraq war logs, was made while I was still trying to decide where the right decision lay. The thing that keeps me awake many nights, and one of the reasons why I remain such a staunch supporter of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, is the question of whether I would have had their courage at that moment if Manning had come across the hall and said to me, "Hey, you work at the State Department. I'm planning to steal 500,000 State Department cables and release them to WikiLeaks. I was wondering if you had any advice for me on that." I don't know what I would have done at that time. And to face the kind of courage that I didn't have, but Manning did, and Julian Assange did at that moment, is a very humbling experience. And it marked me, and it left me marked to this day. And it's one of the reasons that I stand now in support of Julian Assange, because of the personal courage that he showed. But I also am here quite selfishly because Julian now stands at a crossroads of our freedom of speech and our freedom of the press here in the United States. And while people may love him or hate him or think he's a hero or a traitor or a spy or this, or I don't know, I've never met him. Maybe he's mean to puppies. I simply don't know the answer to that, but it really doesn't matter, because history has dropped him at that crossroads, and we are now in a position where his prosecution under the espionage in the United States could represent the first successful third-party prosecution under that archaic law. Up till now, the Espionage Act prosecutions have all been directed against the individuals who stole / leaked / whistleblew documents. People like Chelsea Manning, people who disclosed information like John Kiriakou or Tom Drake or many of the others. They're the ones who have gone to prison. Jeffrey Sterling just was released. They're the ones who have gone to prison. The journalists who received those documents and published them and wrote about them have so far stayed just to the side of the government's heavy acts. And they are not protected. The First Amendment and the Supreme Court rulings going all the way back to the New York Times during the Pentagon Papers era, when Daniel Ellsberg set a pattern of courage for us all. Those Supreme Court decisions have been very, very finely directed, saying the government cannot enjoin a newspaper or media to not publish. They can't censor in advance. But the Supreme Court, particularly in the Ellsberg case, left open the possibility that the government can punish the media after something has been published for violating the Espionage Act. What's happened to date is the government has simply chosen, for public opinion reasons, for publicity reasons, for political reasons, not to exercise that power. We came very, very close in 2014 in the case of James Risen, a reporter for the New York Times at that point. Risen allegedly got some secrets from a former CIA officer, Jeffrey Sterling, and was subpoenaed by Eric Holder, Obama's Attorney General, and was about to be forced to testify and out his source in court, which would have been an absolute game changer and resulted in an immediate guilty decision. Risen resisted the subpoena. He resisted testifying. He brought his resistance all the way to the Supreme Court, who said basically, no, you can be compelled to testify. You as a reporter are not protected from the laws that govern classified information. In the end, for political reasons, the Obama administration backed down, never called Risen to testify, but left the door open that they can, in fact, prosecute a journalist for receiving, transmitting classified material. I am fearful that Julian Assange is that case. The government has been very cautious about not prosecuting people, for example, like Glenn Greenwald, who has published the Edward Snowden disclosures, written about them, put the documents up there. Greenwald is an American citizen. He is a quote-unquote traditional journalist. He has curated the documents. He has been careful in his redactions. He has been releasing them on a very slow and methodical scale. All of those things can be turned around and claim that none of those things apply to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. He's not an American citizen. His actions have not occurred under American jurisdiction, i.e. under the protections of the First Amendment. And the government would be in a position to make a case that Julian is not a journalist and that clicking a button that says upload is not publishing. That wouldn't be a difficult case to make, particularly in the environment currently in the United States, where we have an administration under President Trump that doesn't seem to be overly concerned about public opinion, and where we have a media that should be cheering for Julian Assange, but instead is labeling him another of Putin's puppets. Under those conditions, it would be very easy to see the United States successfully prosecute Julian Assange, claiming he's not a journalist, he's not a publisher, he's not entitled to any First Amendment rights, and that he has mishandled classified information, the same as Chelsea Manning did and everyone else, and he goes straight to jail. The problem is whether you're sitting at home saying, great, throw him away, throw away the key, or you're saying, well, maybe not. It doesn't matter, because that would set a precedent that the government would then be able to use against any other reporter in or out of the United States, American citizen or not. So, for example, it would open the door to third-party prosecutions of reporters who publish, say, a signal number or an encrypted Dropbox address. Are they, in fact, soliciting people to commit federal security crimes? What about technical staff who work at newspapers or websites, who are not journalists themselves, but are part of the process of quote-unquote publishing information to the web? Is, in fact, that the future ahead of us? Or is Julian worth protecting, not for who he is, but what he represents? The idea that WikiLeaks has created a new paradigm for journalism and a new paradigm for publishing. We don't have to rely on reporters' discretion. We don't have to worry whether the New York Times or the Washington Post has taken a phone call from a senior government official and decided not to publish. It's all right there. There is no need to fact check. The facts are in front of you. And WikiLeaks has created this new paradigm that essentially has changed journalism, changed publishing, and it should not be destroyed by an American administration based on, in fact, the technicalities of who is a journalist and what is publishing. That's a long way of explaining why I'm here today and why I support freedom for Julian Assange.
Well, thank you for explaining that beautifully. I think it brings up so many points that need to be discussed and delved into further. Whether it's, your personal history with Chelsea Manning, as far as working in the same location, it's just mind-blowing to consider that two whistleblowers would come from the same exact location in that way. Or in addition to that, though, I do want to discuss with you and ask you more about the way in which the prosecution of WikiLeaks, the persecution of WikiLeaks, could have such a damaging, chilling effect on journalism in America and outside it, in the legacy press sense of the word journalism. Or do you think that WikiLeaks is unique in being persecuted in the sense that it is one outlet or one publishing entity that is outside the control and the influence of the unelected power structure, and that other outlets might not face that same type of persecution?
The reason, for example, the State Department went after me was to create an example, and they thought they had an easy case. People in the State Department don't write critical books. To my knowledge, mine was the first, the only, and probably the last book written by a serving State Department employee critical of the actions of the State Department. And though there was no classified information in my book, they wanted to set an example. They wanted my head on a stick out in the lobby so that others who might be thinking about writing a book or leaking or going public would walk past that every day and realize, it's probably not worth it. In Julian's case, I think that there are a lot of similarities. Obviously, the scale is remarkably different, and I want to stress that I'm not placing myself next to Julian Assange or WikiLeaks, or I'm simply saying there are sort of parallels in the overall methodology here. WikiLeaks has created a new paradigm for publishing. They have created a system that bypasses the restraints, the self-imposed censorship, the unofficial government control of the media, and they've created a new way of doing business. They have created an outlet that's accessible to leakers. Let's not forget that Chelsea Manning tried to contact both the New York Times and the Washington Post with her information, and for whatever reason couldn't get through to them, and ended up at WikiLeaks. That new paradigm is terrifying to the people that run the American government, independent of Republican or Democrat. We need to be very clear that this all began well before Donald Trump took office, and it's going to continue in one form or another well after Donald Trump leaves office. And in fact, Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, was one of the most aggressive advocates of using these tools against free speech and a free press. So this is far, far beyond party politics or partisanship or conservative or liberals. Julian represents something that's very, very frightening to them. He represents a form of transparency, a form of informing the world, in this case, of things that governments want to suppress that exists, till now at least, outside of government control. And that's an important parenthetical, by the way. I want to remind everyone that while I'm an American and I think a lot of the focus is on the United States versus Julian Assange here, it's very important to underline that WikiLeaks has had an effect in countries outside the United States, very significant effect. Their publishing of the Kroll report changed an election in Kenya. The work that they did about the corruption in the Icelandic banks brought down a government there and made changes to the system. A lot of the documents that WikiLeaks published, albeit American documents, affected the Arab Spring. And I'm sure there's much more to come out there. So this is a global phenomena, even though the United States has self-appointed itself the police officer in this case to stop it. WikiLeaks is something to be afraid of if you are the government. And the point is not just to shut down WikiLeaks. So they've been remarkably successful in what they're trying to do, and shutting them down would be something the U.S. government, I think, would be pleased to say they've done. But more importantly, to set that example, to create legal precedent where none exists, to go after people who are publishers, to weaken the definition of journalism and publishing in the digital age. And to say there are new markers out there, and every time that you guys on this side create this new paradigm, we're going to push back on this side and make it go away. And if you can create that precedent through the prosecution of Julian Assange, of going after the publishers, the transmitters, if you will, to use a more neutral term, that frightens a lot of people. People who might be willing to take a chance under current circumstances would easily back away if that precedent is set. And of course, the US government, now having aligned itself with the petty bureaucracies and tyrannies of the old Soviet Union and the old communist China, of saying, well, fine, if we can't bring him into a court, or we can't lock him up in Guantanamo or someplace like that, fine. A little room in the Ecuadorean Embassy is, I guess, the best we can come up with at this point in time, so fine, let it be that. And America saw how that works when we gave freedom and asylum to people in our embassies and consulates during the Cold War, and during the modern times in China. And it's fine. If we can't go all the way, we'll go part of the way. And again, same with Manning and these others. With Thomas Drake, for example, an early whistleblower out of the NSA, they couldn't actually figure out a way to get him into prison. So they settled for some trumped up charges that he did community service for, but they broke him as a professional. They caused him enormous economic damage, and they walked away wiping their hands saying, hey, good enough. It'd be great if he was in Supermax, but we'll take the fact that we helped ruin his life, destroy him in some small way. And that may end up, I almost can't find a way to say the words, that may end up the best outcome here, is that Julian is left in that embassy in Ecuador, blocked from communicating with the outside world, inhibited in his ability to run WikiLeaks himself. That may be, quote, the best the U.S. government can do here. But they're paying very close attention to this. And I can assure you that the next person who takes Julian's place, who stands up where he may not be able to, will not be granted the leeway that Julian was in the early days. They figured this game out now, and using these tools, which have been refined and honed, will be going after the next people much, much, much more aggressively. And that, too, is a reason to stand up for Julian, to make sure that whatever test case the U.S. government makes out of him is as weak and as fragile and looks as petty as it can be. We'll set our own symbols. We'll put our own flag in the lobby instead of his head on a stick.
Absolutely. I think that's a completely chilling image. And I think it's really one that people have to take on board deeply and really understand the risk that Julian Assange has taken, along with the whistleblowers that you've discussed, along with yourself. Can you describe what you think the audience, viewers and listeners can do to help fight for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks? I asked that to pretty much all of the panelists, but I think your perspective on that is really, really important to get.
There are a number of wonderful people, including people who organize this vigil, the people who work for WikiLeaks, who work for the Electronic Freedom Foundation, a number of other places that are already working very hard for Julian. And we can support all of those organizations. But in order for more people to lend their support in the various forms that you can lend support, if you know how to code, you can code. If you have some money to donate, you can donate. If you sign petitions, you can support these things in whatever way fits with what you do. But the main thing that I think people listening here have to do is understand the stakes. Understand that these issues go beyond an individual. Put aside the propaganda that has been put out. Julian is a spy. Julian is a rapist. Julian is this. Julian is that. I would say don't waste your time worrying about those things. Stipulate them however you want to stipulate them, and then set it aside. Because this is an instance where an individual has stumbled into an important role in history that transcends him as a person. While his personal rights are of extreme importance to me, they may or may not be as significant to others who should not step back from this fight because of that. People should understand that the prosecution, the persecution of Julian Assange is directly related to the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press in the United States. He's the first one. He's the canary in the coal mine. And by refusing to support him because you don't like what happened with the Democratic emails, or refusing to support him because you've been told he's a bad man, means that you're giving up a chance to support those very freedoms which are so dear to us. This isn't a time where you get to say, well, I'll wait for the next bus and I'll get on that one. This is a time where the bus is already in process of leaving and you need to get on it, and you need to find which method of supporting Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is the one you're capable of adding something to, and add that something to it.
Absolutely. Thank you for outlining that for our audience. I completely agree. I think that people really do get caught up in the propaganda narratives that, try to shift opinions one way or the other. And as you've mentioned, what gets left behind then is the historical significance of what Julian Assange has done and the role that WikiLeaks has played in revolutionizing journalism and the suffering that happens as a result of that. As a person who has experienced the ire of the United States power structure, on a human level, how do you relate to what Julian Assange is going through right now? What do you?
What I suffered was a common cold compared to the cancer that the U.S. government has imposed on Julian Assange. But I can draw from that experience and maybe offer some insight. It is a frightening thing to understand that the vast powers of the United States are being aimed at you. That you as an individual have this massive apparatus aimed at you that is designed to destroy you in whatever form it can actually accomplish that. And to realize that is a terrifying thought. In my case, I was facing the destruction of myself as a person, my self-image. I was facing the destruction of the promises that I had made to my family, to work hard for them, to support them. I had 2 children at that time who were on the edge of getting ready to go to college, who were wondering how they were going to be able to afford that in the United States if I was sent home without the money that I had expected to be there, that I had earned to be there. It is a time that puts you in enormous self-doubt, that requires you to say, what is important to me? Where are those lines to be drawn? Julian can walk out of the Ecuadorean Embassy today. He can be arrested by the British. He would no doubt be extradited to the United States. He doesn't have to stay there. And that question must dog him and dog others in those situations. I don't have to be here. There are other things I can do. I can take a walk into the sunlight today and take my chances. I've got good lawyers. Maybe they can find a way. Those nagging doubts have to compete with the certainty that what you are doing is so right that it is worth the pain and the penalties and the sleepless nights that must accompany facing those decisions. At the base level, it becomes extraordinarily difficult as an individual to stand up to that without looking for ways to make it go away. In my case, for example, I found far, far too much comfort in the bottom of bottles of alcohol. I found too much comfort in acting out poorly towards people who loved me and cared for me and wanted to help me. I cannot imagine that someone in Julian's situation isn't feeling those same pressures and pushing back against them, I hope, by realizing that's exactly what the bad guys want him to do, is to succumb to those pressures. The bad guys being, in this case, and I say it with great shame, my own government.
Absolutely. And I know that we've discussed this previously in other, Unity 4J vigils, but to your point, we know that Julian Assange has, serious medical issues, as well as the emotional burden that you're describing when you are the focus of that state-sponsored ire. We know that his tooth desperately needs to be remedied, and he can't get those medical services. It just adds to the degree of destruction personally that people experience in positions like this.
We provide medical care to the darkest of our prisons in the United States, in Guantanamo. We are now crying as a nation over the lack of access to medical care that's shown to people that are locked up in some of our deportation facilities. But at the same time, far too many of my fellow citizens are pleased with the thought that Assange may be suffering in some way out there locked up in the Ecuadorean Embassy, that the British refusal to allow him even safe passage to a hospital with a return to the embassy is being denied. That remains an act of cruelty that if I was a British citizen, I would scream against my government. That I'm an American citizen knowing my government is supporting that leaves me shamefully feeling disgusted with those decisions. If the man needs medical attention, for the love of God, let him have medical attention. Nothing is going to be changed by the fact that he's healed. Everything will be changed to know that the American government and the British government allowed a man's health to deteriorate simply because they wanted to be petty enough to see him suffer when the law wouldn't allow them to punish him in a more overt physical way.
Absolutely. And I think that perspective of not only his physical suffering, but emotional suffering from your own experience is so important for the viewers and listeners to understand. I also wanted to get your insight on the news we heard just recently in the last couple of weeks in regards to, James Comey scuttling the immunity deal in early 2017 that was being sort of discussed between WikiLeaks and so I was wondering what you thought about the fact that those negotiations were kind of killed off. If you have any other information that you'd like to share from your history.
Absolutely. Now, of course, we only know what little has been leaked out, and we don't know for sure what actually was happening and what actually was planned, but it appears that the United States government at some form was in some form of discussion / negotiation, whatever we want to label, you want to put it, that Julian would be offered a form of immunity, some version of that, in return for his testimony about some of the documents that made it to WikiLeaks that may have affected the outcome of our 2016 election. I don't want to be pinned down on words here because they get all very slippery in us. But basically what we have come to understand is that James Comey, as head of the FBI, played a role in ending that discussion at whatever level it was taking place. That essentially the truth or the information about what happened in 2016 was less important than continuing the unofficial punishment of Julian Assange. That's disgraceful if it's true. That's disgraceful both for what it says about the United States and its commitment to truth, and it's disgraceful in what it says about its willingness to continue to use any unofficial means possible to increase the suffering of one man over acts that have long since taken place. There's no way to go back in history. You can put Julian on a cross and throw a spear into his side, and none of that changes what's already happened out there. The documents on WikiLeaks exist forever. Others have already taken his place, providing information and maintaining those documents. Other sites will stand up and continue to do this. You're talking about here vengeance. You're talking about revenge. And those are sad, sad things for his country with as much potential and as much bravado about how it holds to human rights standards, to say that the efforts of the United States government and perhaps of James Comey as an individual are directed to that level of petty revenge. If it's true, I hope the corner of hell where Comey ends up stays as warm as it is right now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that it's important for our viewers to understand these events from that type of unique view that you have of these situations. I was wondering as well what you feel about just the fact that if WikiLeaks were to be successfully shut down by the United States government, or if Assange were to not be able to operate as editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks,
right.
Do you think that there would be any other entity that would rise up in the place of that? And I asked that because CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou, who has joined our streams a number of times, has said repeatedly that he feels that there is no other journalistic outlet that is a safe place for whistleblowers to turn to when they want to publish their information. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, on the lack of a safe entity that whistleblowers could turn to publish their
I absolutely agree with that. The thing that makes WikiLeaks so unique is their lack of a political position other than transparency and truth. The idea would be that if I were to have a piece of information that discredits Donald Trump, there are media outlets in the United States who would jump on that information, and there are media outlets in the United States who would go nowhere near that information. There are media outlets who would not even bother to talk with me, and others who would try to elevate me into some kind of superstar status for it. And that's very, very wrong. Transparency is what it is. You see what you see when the shades are lifted, and sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing. Julian has proven his commitment to that. During the Iraq War, when he released the information that Chelsea Manning provided, he was a hero of the so-called liberal left and an enemy of the so-called conservative right. He was a traitor in their minds and a hero. Now, after he's released the DNC emails that appeared to have affected Hillary Clinton's candidacy for the president, that's flip-flopped. He's now supported by the same people who hated him then and opposed by the people. To me, that's a badge of honor. That is a very clear sign that WikiLeaks' commitment is to transparency, not to partisanship. And I don't know of any other outlet that can make that claim and, more importantly, back it up with real world evidence. Where they've had the chance to be partisan, they've chosen not to do it. And WikiLeaks is the only place that's there. My fear, as I expressed earlier, is that if the US government is successful in prosecuting Julian Assange, it will be a warning that will scare off a lot of well-meaning people who might otherwise create things like WikiLeaks to take the place of the site if it were to go down, if it were to disappear, if Julian was thrown into prison or something like it, or if the US government finds some other means to make it go away. The idea would be that using the power of the internet and the power of truth, that WikiLeaks is just what we have right now. It will be replaced by something stronger and more powerful in these ways. But the US government is looking to get rid of Julian Assange in whatever form that ends up taking as a way, as a hedge against that future. And that's why I cannot stress enough, the battle here is not over one individual's freedom, it's over the freedom of speech and freedom of the press for all of us. And if history has chosen Julian Assange to be that case where that battle is fought, then that's so be it. We didn't ask to be invited into this room, but this is the room we're in. And it's so, so, so important to set aside partisanship and support the truth here as what's most important.
Definitely. And as a final kind of question and thought, building on the way that WikiLeaks is unique as a publishing outlet, we've seen them, and returning to Chelsea Manning, we've seen them not only be one of the few safe outlets that has never disclosed a source. They are also an entity that has advocated for whistleblowers directly, and we don't see that in the cases of other whistleblowers who have gone to different outlets in the same way. So I didn't know, just as a final kind of segment of thought, your view of WikiLeaks in its unique role as an advocate of whistleblowers as well as a safe, publishing entity.
Absolutely. And that's very, very important because whistleblowers are very delicate people. We face these acts of conscience and we face a tremendous risk, whether it's the risk to financial risk, psychological risk, or right up to life itself risk. We need to be nurtured and encouraged and understand that if we take these steps, we will be safe in doing so. The hypocrisy of mainstream media towards whistleblowers is complete. The New York Times, for example, has been very critical of Julian Assange in a number of situations, while at the same time writing stories based on the documents that he posts. You can't have it both ways, but the New York Times and other mainstream media tries to do that. They don't encourage necessarily all whistleblowing, though they're very happy to encourage some that fits with their existing narratives. The thing about WikiLeaks that makes it so valuable is its commitment is simply to truth and transparency. It's not a commitment to any partisanship. It'll actually annoy pretty much everybody, but that's a sign that they're doing something right. We need non-traditional media. We need media that operates in a global environment. We need media that operates in a digital environment. And right now, the only thing we have is Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And that's why I'm here today, and that's why all of us are participating in this vigil today.
Well, thank you, Peter, so much for your insight on all of these topics. We're honored that you joined us, and I hope that we will, if we are forced to do another vigil like this, I look forward to you participating again. It has been humbling to speak with you. Thank you so much.
And it's been an honor to be here and speak up in support of someone like Julian Assange.